Although he isn't its best-known name today, I would argue that nobody was more important in theorizing and giving shape to the late 19th and early 20th century literary movement known as the Chicago Renaissance than Hamlin Garland. That movement, the Chicago Renaissance, is sometimes said to begin in 1893 with Henry Blake Fuller's novel The Cliff Dwellers, which was perhaps the first realistic novel about a skyscraper city. Fuller and Hamlin Garland were actually best friends, and they were both leaders of the artistic circle known as the Little Room. That was kind of the epicenter of the Chicago Renaissance, at least at that phase of it. But Fuller and Garland's literary values were very different, and Fuller actually satirizes Garland hilariously in a novella called The Downfall of Abner Joyce, just devoted to exploring their differences. So I want to bring Garland into focus by briefly contrasting these two writers, these two kind of founding fathers of Chicago fiction. Henry Blake Fuller's Cliff Dwellers hits on the themes that we would expect to see in an early Chicago novel. The new city, full of new money, people cut off from their roots, remaking themselves into whoever they want to be, and slipping up and down the social ladder. Fuller's Chicago was a world of artificiality and anonymity, and it's easy to see in this novel the precedent for novels like Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, or other novels of urban kind of anomie like James T. Farrell's Studs Lonigan books. At the same time that Fuller was writing The Cliff Dwellers, though, Hamlin Garland was working on his own Chicago novel called Rose of Dutcher's Cooley, which came out in 1895, and we'll be reading from Rose of Dutcher's Cooley in a minute. Rose of Dutcher's Cooley is the opposite of Fuller's novel of rootlessness. Instead, it's about how Chicago was a place where deeply rooted people, the people of the farms and small towns of the Midwest, come together. For Garland, Chicago was a catch basin where the best and brightest minds of the rural Midwest would gather, a place where the artistic consciousness of that whole region would be forged. Garland recognized that artists need cities. There's no economic support for them out on the farms. So rural artists, if there was going to be a rural art at all, would have to come to Chicago, even though their artistic concerns might actually remain rural. So Chicago would be kind of an urban base for a rural perspective. And that's what happens in his novel Rose of Dutcher's Cooley. A rural poet comes to Chicago and eventually learns enough about her art to really write well about her hometown back in Wisconsin. And that was kind of Garland's story too, the rural Midwesterner who came to Chicago. And by the way, Don Evans asked me to be sure to mention where in the city he lived, so I'm going to squeeze that in right here. He first lived near the intersection of Elm Street and Lakeshore Drive, and then later he had a townhouse in the Woodlawn neighborhood at 64th and Greenwood, if you want to make a pilgrimage. Anyhow, Garland's regional view of Chicago, with its dynamic but somewhat tense relationship between the city and its rural hinterland, is a precedent just as important as Fuller's Cliff Dwellers for Chicago literature. Garland's perspective anticipates Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River anthology, Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and Willa Cather's Song of the Lark, all of which have this kind of way of imagining Chicago in dialogue with a vast rural background. If Henry Blake Fuller is the patron saint of Chicago literature as an urban literature, the literature of skyscrapers, Hamlin Garland is the patron saint of Chicago literature as Midwestern, and maybe even just Western literature. At the time, what we call the Midwest, they still called the West. So for Garland, it's not the skyscraper, but the railroad connecting Chicago with all those other places way out there that was kind of the dominating image for the city. Garland believed that all literature should essentially be regional, and that art with no regional consciousness was kind of artificial. He was at the forefront of a wider movement for regionalism, or so-called local color, in American literature, and he argued in his book Crumbling Idols that with the rise of the Midwest as America's most economically productive region, Chicago would inevitably rise as the nation's literary capital. He grew up on a series of farmsteads in Wisconsin, Iowa, and South Dakota, and his own early successes, work like the short story collection Main Traveled Roads, established him as the voice of that region. Later, his memoirs, beginning with A Son of the Middle Border, would return to those places. But he was wrong about regionalism being the future of American literature. After he wrote that book, Crumbling Idols, New York actually became more central, not less central, to publishing. And Garland eventually moved there, as did so many other writers of his generation who had gotten their start in Chicago and kind of put their chips on Chicago. His focus shifted away from the Midwest toward adventure stories of the Far West, the Southwest, and the Klondike. And furthermore, as Chicago became ever more multi-ethnic, identifying the city with the mostly Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian rural Midwestern kind of farm boys and farm girls who came to the city made less and less sense. Nonetheless, Garland's vision of Chicago as a city of transplants rather than a city of rootless people, as a city that, despite all its smokestacks and skyscrapers, remains connected with far-flung little hometowns and with the big breezy atmosphere of the American West, well, he wasn't totally wrong about that. Thank you.
You've heard a little bit about Hamlin Garland being caught up with other artists, not just folks with a literary bent. And he served, not surprisingly, he was so gregarious, he served as the first president of the Cliff Dwellers Club. And on the club's centenary year, I was the 37th president, and so I've been asked tonight to talk a little bit, besides reading from that novel, talk a little bit about the relationship that Garland had with both the Cliff Dwellers and the city of Chicago. So he arrived here in 1892, and he began socializing almost immediately with the great sculptor Laredo Taft, and indeed, shortly thereafter, married Taft's sister. And then all of them were socializing for many years in the Fine Arts Building, South Michigan Avenue, where Taft had his studio. And late in the evenings, the building was filled with artists, and they'd go up to a studio on the top of that building, and that was what was called initially the little room. But in the wake of the Columbian World's Exposition, there was a cultural revival. You've heard a little bit about that also. And Garland came to have the view that what the city really needed, it was time for Chicago to have a more formal social organization devoted to the arts. And he had in mind getting that started, and he did. He was a terrific organizer. And in 1907, that club was formally organized as the Attic Club. And 2 years later, in 1909, the club moved into its own premises for the club on the top 2 floors of Orchestra Hall, quite up in the ethereal reaches of Orchestra Hall was really where the club lived. On the first anniversary that the club had moved into its space at Orchestra Hall, Garland wrote a verse, and the verse was to celebrate an exquisite silver punch bowl that had been crafted by Robert Jarvie, a club member and a great artisan of the day. And Garland's poem captures, not just then, but I think today, the essence of the Cliff Dwellers and what it was trying to achieve and largely does achieve. And that is to create an oasis of calm and a place for the appreciation of the arts and the good fellowship that goes with that, and to do this in the middle of a city that's filled with commercial striving and competition, and it was really a great achievement. And the fact that it's going today in an era hardly friendly to these kinds of social structures is quite something. So here is Garland's 1910 verse, "Warriors are we, but in another fashion. Rivals for wealth and happiness and fame, down in the city's deeps we meet in savage fashion and play as best we may this selfish, sordid game. But here, at peace, before these glowing embers meeting this ample bowl's hospitable design, man greets his fellow man and only then remembers art's magic bond of light and beauty, bloodless shrine." So to read just a couple of selections from Rose of Detrus Cooley, you'll get a sense of his way with words. This is from chapter 15, Chicago. "Somewhere just ahead it sat, this mighty hive of 1.5 million people. The thought of it made her heart beat quick and her throat filled. She was going there. The lake was there, art was there, and music and the drama and love. All was under each emotion, always behind every success was the understanding that love was to be the woman's reward and recompense. It was not articulate nor feverish, this thought. It was a deep, pure emotion, streaming always towards the unknown. She dreamed as the train rumbled on. She would succeed. She must succeed. She gripped the seat rail with her broad, strong hands and braced herself like one entering a flood. It was this wonderful thing again, a fresh, young, and powerful soul rushing to a great city, a shining atom of steel obeying the magnet, a clear rivulet from the hills hurrying to the sea. On every train at that same hour from every direction, others like her were entering on the same search to the same end. See that cloud? Someone said. That's Chicago. From chapter 16, A Fresh Conquest. A fresh, keen east wind had arisen, pure and exhilarating, and the smooth expanse of glittering green and blue water stretched out under a vivid blue sky in which great clouds floated like snow mountains, trailing great shadows like robes of state upon the lake. The curving lake wall was wet and glistened with the upflung spray. The girl felt her soul grow larger as she faced this scene, so strange, so oriental, and she looked and looked until it became a part of her. And finally, from chapter 17, her first dinner out. Rose went to see the parts of the city which no true Chicagoan ever visits. That is to say, she spent Sunday in the park, admiring with pathetic fortitude the sward, the curving drives, and the bridges and the statues. In company with the lowly and nameless multitude, she even crowded in to see the animals. Around her streamed floods of the city's newly acquired residents, clerks, bookkeepers, typewriters, shopgirls, butcher's boys, salesmen, all fresh from the small towns and from the farms of the West.
On behalf of my three sisters, Catherine, Constance, and Helene, I'm truly honored to receive this very special recognition for our great-grandfather. I've learned so much about Hamlin's ties to Chicago over this past week, and I'd like to personally thank all of you who made this event possible tonight. Although my great-grandfather was not necessarily known for his poetic contributions, I'd like to share a short poem with you. This poem was sent to me by my aunt, Connie Harper Nelson. She's pictured with my dad in those pictures, over 2 decades ago. In October of 2003, I was deployed to a massive wildland fire in San Diego County out in California named the Cedar Fire. The fire, fanned by destructive Santa Ana winds, eventually consumed over 250,000 acres of tender dry vegetation, destroyed over 2,000 homes, and killed 15 people, including a firefighter who was working in a division adjacent to me. The Cedar Fire remains one of the most destructive fires in California history. On the night that my strike team left from the San Francisco Bay Area en route to Southern California, my Aunt Connie ensured that I had this. The poem is named, "Do You Fear the Force of the Wind?" Do you fear the force of the wind, the slash of the rain? Go face them and fight them. Be savage again. Go hungry and cold like the wolf. Go wade like the crane. The palms of your hands will thicken, the skin of your forehead tan. You'll be ragged and swarthy and weary, but you'll walk like a man. Hamlin Garland. In closing, thank you all so much. My family feels truly blessed to have been able to share this special evening with all of you. Thank you.